Do I see it long term? Yes, no, right? Then I go ahead and sign. But I think that's a little longer process, because deciding that here to Seoul is a valuable route today is difficult. So you've flown it for a year and a half, right? So I think you play that game a little bit with the internationals, and the incentive program tries to kind of negate that 25% fee out of that for that period that airline's trying to establish itself. So I think it's going to be okay. I think even the internationals will be okay once they establish that route and have confidence in that route. I think it'll be all right.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Any other questions on the lease agreement? Great, thank you, Director.
I'd sit down, but I think I'm next.
Well, I think I'm going to let you sit down for just a minute, because we have members of the public that have come in and have requested to speak on OEI, and I think that what I'm going to do is take their, let them make their statements thus before we get into OEI.
Okay.
And so, a couple of minutes is what we're going to allow, because we are supposed to be done here at 6:30, and I'm worried about our timing at this point. Also, those members of the public that entered the room, I made a statement at the beginning of the meeting that there would be no action taken at this evening's meeting. So this is for discussion. We may be having another meeting next week. We'll discuss that at the end of this meeting. And so, Mr. Holbrook, would you like to
thank you.
speak to us? Thank you, sir.
I'm Robert Holbrook, a resident of Mountain View, and airplane noise is complex, and I believe that the proposed increase in building heights might have a consequence that the memo you're about to review has not considered at all, and that is the shifting of noise. The mechanism for the shift is pretty technical. Taller buildings might affect the wind speed trigger used by TRACON to invoke south flow operations. The trigger is currently 5 knots. If it had to be lowered to 3 or 4 knots, and I don't know that it would, that would mean more south flow and residents affected by south flow traffic on more days. The inverse question of whether the trigger could be raised was considered 2 years ago. Summarizing the FAA position at that time, Representative Ro Khanna's district manager wrote, "The FAA said that there were 2 reasons why San Jose Airport would not be granted a waiver of the 5-knot standard for landing with a tailwind," that is to say, increasing it. The first is the length of the runway, because it takes more runway to land with the wind at your back. San Jose's runway is too short. Part of the reason that it is too short is the buildings in downtown, which make a piece of that end of the runway unusable. Planes can't drop down until they are past those buildings. But that was not the whole cause of the runway being too short. It was too short anyway. Increasing the height of the buildings in question might worsen this effect. Noise shifting is such a hot topic that I hope the Commission will seek to understand this better before approving a memo that might enable such a shift. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Holbrook. And Jennifer, I don't see a last name on here.
It's Tassa.
Please feel free to come up
Jennifer
and
from Sunnyvale,
speak.
so.
And then I'm going to give this back to you and ask you if you'll complete that in its entirety and make sure that Mr. Kazmarzak gets that. I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, great. I'm a Sunnyvale resident. I'm representing the Cupertino and Sunnyvale Airplane Noise Group, and I wish I was a little bit more prepared for this, but we found out this was kind of happening on Thursday. But I would, like Robert, strongly recommend a no approval vote on this, not at this time, but when you finally decide, in order to give the ability to have a study regarding whether the south flow trigger would be impacted in any way. In other words, would the trigger be impacted so as to cause more increases in south flow operations over Sunnyvale or Cupertino, Mountain View, Palo Alto? The report considered financial aspects and FAA regulations, but it never considered anything about the south flow triggers. It considered departures only, it never considered arrivals. And this could be an issue. We just don't know how that trigger is going to be impacted. And again, during the meeting with Ro Khanna, there was a question as to the current impact of of the taller buildings currently in San Jose. So the question becomes, will taller buildings even exacerbate the problem even more? Already we've got a problem with airplane noise in the South Flow. We would just be potentially exacerbating that, and that could be a problem. The other thing to consider is if you've ever been downtown when those arrivals are coming in under normal flow, they are close to those buildings. There's a stream of planes that go in straight into the airport, 2 runways, 30R and 30L, where those planes appear based on the web tracker to be closer than 500 feet to the tops of those buildings. I'm not saying that the whole area would be impacted, but those straight lines right into the airport, we probably have to be looking at. And again, I think the study was great, but it needs to be expanded. And I would strongly recommend that that is done.
Great, thank you so much for your comments this evening.
Thank you.
Director, let's move into OEL.
Okay, so on OEI, just kind of give you some background. This is basically going to be the presentation that we give to CED later next month. Or later this month, I guess. So this is the challenge that the committee was given. Downtown and the airport are both important to the city. They both need to prosper, so you got to find a solution to this. The FAA only protects for Part 77 and the TERPs, the terminal arrival procedures. The Part 77 and the TERPs don't consider one engine out. They consider a fully operational aircraft running on the approaches or the departures, and so they protect that airspace. The OEI study was last conducted in 2007, established the straight out in the west corridor. The idea the straight out was already set for us because Adobe was already built. So the straight out corridor is built based on that building. And then the west corridor in the Dearborn Station area plan was to always be low rise. The tallest thing was going to be the baseball stadium if you read through the Dearborn Station plan. And so that was a perfect place to put the traffic and to put the corridor over the Dearborn Station. So we did that. The OEI surfaces are different in the view of the FAA because they're not strictly a safety issue. They are a financial issue. So the plane can always make it out safe. You just have to take off more weight, and that is financial. I took off a person, I took off some cargo, now I'm losing money on that flight. So the FAA doesn't protect to that level because it's not a strictly safety item. It is a economic item for the airlines. So that leaves the local planning department to deal with this or not in those surfaces. So within the TERPs, they have a climb departure area and a final approach area that they're protecting for, but those are fully operational airplanes. Go ahead and go to the next one. Just to give you kind of a aerial view of the two areas. The downtown core would be the straight out from the 2 runways. That's also the approach path. Those buildings won't be getting all that much higher because the Adobe is already there. And again, OEI has nothing to do with TERPs, and TERPs is set for the arrivals or the departures. So to partially answer their questions, although I'm not going to, those will never affect the arrivals or the departures because that's based on a both engine situation. So those are already protected regardless what we do with OEI. Dearborn Station is the west corridor, so that west is down if you kind of orient yourself. So the Dearborn is that west course correction of 15 degrees to get over that, what was going to be the low part of downtown in the old station plan. This is kind of a pictorial of what you're flying. So a fully functional aircraft is on the purple line. You take off, gear up, keep climbing, level out, get your speed up, and then climb out the rest of the way. The obstructions are set on the blue line. The green line is the minimum clearance that the FAA will it is plotting for, and then there's a buffer to the OEI. You see, the green line and the red line are not the same. So the FAA is building in kind of almost a double buffer, the 35-foot clearance plus the buffer, so that airplane with the one engine inoperative has to be able to maintain that climb profile out of here, and the pinch points are based on the building. So you have to climb till you get to a certain point so you can keep clearing those buildings. So that line is adjusted for whatever obstructions are down line from it. So there's a couple things that the airlines can do, like we talked about. They can request another runway. They can just sit and wait until they can take off to the north. Sometimes if the winds are at 5 knots and they've stayed in a south flow, if they wait for it, ATC can get them cycled into a north departure, because that would be basically a 5-knot tailwind departure. And if they can calculate that they've got enough room to do that, they can take off to the north during that south flow opportunity. They can offload passengers and cargo, financial hit. They can make a refueling stop, extremely embarrassing for the airline, for the airport. They can cancel the current day's flight. They can just say, we're not operating today, all of you people go home, come back tomorrow, here's a voucher, or we'll protect you out of San Francisco on a different flight. They can change the aircraft. They can't do that on the day. They have to do that forever. So they would pick a different aircraft that performs better. Usually those aircraft have more seats on it. So they have to be financially viable, right? You don't want to fly a half-empty plane just because it has OEI performance. They can change the OEI procedure. OEI procedures are not set by us or the FAA. It's unique to each airline. So they say what they're going to do in their emergency situation. Am I going to go straight out? Am I going to turn to the right? Am I going to do circles? You don't want to do too much because you have one engine not working. And pilots don't like a lot of change when one engine's not operating. They're in the cockpit going through their checklist, trying to make sure that the airplane is safe and maintainable. They don't want to have to think about, I'm supposed to do a climbing right turn at 30 degrees and spiral. They don't want to do that. They want the best thing for a plane with an engine out is wings level, climb out the best you can, not making a turn, not doing that kind of stuff. So the airlines can do what they want, but they have to work with their pilot unions and the flight crews to figure out what they want to do as their thing. So they have some opportunities. I have a list that will talk about which airlines use the straight out, which ones will turn to the right, the 15 degrees, and it's just about their procedures. So there are different things that they can do. And then the worst thing, they cancel the service and say, look, this happens too many times, I can't afford it, it makes the whole flight unprofitable, and we're stopping the flight out of San Jose because of it. The steering committee that met now, I guess, 8 times. We have people from the community. We got SPUR, the Downtown Association, SVO, the Building Trades Group, Residents for Responsible Development.
It's from the Building Trades Group.
Okay. Silicon Valley Leadership Group. Julie is there mostly as a downtown resident. I've got myself, Kim Wallish, and staff from OED, Rosalind from the Planning and Building Code Enforcement. District 3 is represented there, and the mayor's office is represented there, and we have a couple consultants that have been working with us. So we kind of started off with a process that would get us through assembling the facts that we all didn't agree. This was a controversial issue in 2007, and it didn't get any better with just avoiding it for 11 years. So we had to agree on the facts. So we had to work through that. Then we had to work on some what-if scenarios, which are the 4, 7, and 10 that I referred to earlier. Look at the trade-offs of each of those. Oh, I could build high, but I can't fly to here, and kind of look at the trade-offs on each of those scenarios. And then look for potential solutions. We even looked at other case studies of other airports that have OEI issues and how did they adapt to it. And then our plan was to come up with a recommendation, which I think we have, that's going forward to CED. There have been some stakeholder conversations where the asterisks are, and in fact there is one on Wednesday morning where I meet with the building and developer community. which is always a challenging conversation when you're on my side of the fence. But we meet with them and kind of talk to them about where we are and where we're going. So we have that on Wednesday morning. Go ahead. Just a little information. This was important to the steering committee, trying to understand how many operations from each airline. That helped us work on what destinations had more activity and kind of just understanding who was who had a big impact and who didn't. So this next one is our flow on average, and we've had peak years and low years, but on average we're still at about 13% of the time that we're in south flow. You look at 2016, it was higher than that, but you look back in 2013, it was in single digits. But overall, for that, whatever it is, 15, 14-year period, is 13%. So going through the scenarios real quick. We started out with, you notice some numbers are skipped. We started out with 9 scenarios. Some of them were written off right away as not practical and didn't need to spend the money. Every one we studied cost money from the consultants, right? So we then had to prioritize them, and we picked a few of them that we really wanted to study. And then we picked a few aircraft, because you have to put that aircraft through all of those scenarios, which just means money, for me paying the consultant to do that. So we picked some of our more popular airplanes that were going to destinations that we thought were going to be impacted, and kind of that's where we started. And then we made some other assumptions. Oh, no, I'm not on assumptions yet. Go ahead. So just to talk about the different scenarios, in scenario 4, the downtown core only goes up about 5 to 35 feet because the Adobe building's already there and the Terps are right above it. And so if you went to Terps and just got rid of OEI, you'd only be able to gain a little bit of distance there, not a big building. Over the Dearborn station, it's 70 to 150 feet, because remember, that was planned to stay low, and if we raise it all the way up to the Terps, there's a tremendous benefit over there. Scenario 10, what we basically did was start with today and jack it up 50 feet, or a little bit of a few degrees on the departure, and so it just triggers up a little bit. Because scenario D assumes the straight out stays, there's no change in straight out, but it's just different levels of change over the Dearborn station based on how, if we go from the 62 to 1 or whatever to a 58 to 1 and keep working your way up, that's what you get. And then scenario 7 is straight out, you have OEI protection. The Adobe building remains the controlling factor, but the west corridor goes all the way up to the Terps. That's why you see 0 and 70 to 150. And then scenario 9 is kind of what I consider just a dream state, that you didn't even follow Terps. You just assumed you were going to go higher. You were going to petition the FAA to remove Terps on certain approaches that we don't use very often, or certain things that we don't think are necessary, and you're just going to keep raising it. We've eventually taken that out of the list because it's such an extreme thing, and it would take years to work with the FAA to remove, the non-DME ILS approach to 3.0 is not going to be one they take out of the list very fast. So, so that's what each of the scenarios would mean to you as far as height changes. So here's the other assumptions we made. Certain aircraft, certain maximum takeoff weight and seats, certain markets that we wanted to look at, and then seasonal temperatures. We have differences in summer and winter, both on temperatures and on winds aloft. So, the flights over the Pacific are very different when the winds are fighting you the whole way. Because remember, when you take off from here, you're flying to the west, which means you're flying in a headwind the whole way, which means I need more fuel, which means I may have to take off more passengers because I put more investment into my fuel. And, part of my max weight is in fuel because I'm heading into a headwind the whole way. So we looked at it both summer and winter because we really wanted to examine what the changes would be. So from there, we set on our different cities that we felt were kind of the important cities to us. New York, as you can see in scenario 4, the A320 takes a cargo penalty hit, and in 10D, the 737-800 only takes it in scenario 9. And then in the summertime, the A320 takes a couple people and all of their cargo goes off in scenario 4, and then more in 9 and 10D. We're focusing on trying to find a scenario that has the least amount of impact on all of these cities. So as you can see, 9 is starting to fall off the list already just on New York. We're kind of concentrating on the other ones. So as we go to the next city pair, no, I'll be all right. I'll just get up and leave and figure it out. So on Hawaii, there's no issue in the wintertime. In the summertime, the A321 takes a little bit of a cargo hit in scenario 4, but you can see it has a tremendous cargo already. It has a 21,658 pound potential, and you're losing 593. If you look at the 737-800, they've already taken off a lot of the cargo just to get out of here and make it even without OEI. So that both planes are operating fine. There's not a lot of cargo demand going to Hawaii. So those planes both operate just fine to Hawaii. Frankfurt, which was basically we wanted to hit the European continent, even though we only have London right now. London is shorter, so I knew if I could make Frankfurt, I could make London. So I went ahead and picked the further city to try to say, hey, I want to keep going to the continent. Even though Lufthansa may have had the wrong plane for that market, it's important to us. So we went through with the 787-9, which is what British Airways flies to London, and the 777-300ER. And you look at scenario 4, Frankfurt, there's a pretty significant cargo hit in scenario 4. There's a little less than 7, and you can see the rest of them. The 777-300 does pretty good in all of them. When you figure it can have 62,000 pounds of cargo and you only lost 4,400, that's not a significant amount of cargo coming off the plane. And then in the summertime, the 787 loses a couple seats, but remember that's off a 290 seat configuration. Now British Airways is flying the 787-9, and I don't think they have the 290 configuration, right?
Yeah, 216.
Okay, so naturally, because they have more of those lay-down seats and more of the spread out, they're already going to be below some of those numbers. Now, the lay-down seats weigh more and everything, so there's a bigger calculation than I can do in my head right here for you, but it's probably not an issue in a normal business 2-class or 3-class airplane. It's not going to be an issue going even all the way to Frankfurt. So next we'll go to Asia, which is the place we have the biggest issue. It's a long flight. It has a lot of winds aloft. So the 787 loses passenger. You can see the 51 passengers that we talked about in scenario 4. That's what Hainan I think said 53 passengers, but I mean we're in the ballpark, 51, 53. You're pretty darn close. In the summertime, it goes up a little bit to 56. You can see the cargo's all gone. So if you only have 10,853 pounds available, it's all gone in the wintertime, and most of it's gone in the summertime. And then the 777-300 has a little bit of cargo, but no penalties on the passengers. So again, it's the aircraft that you choose, but then can you fill that 777-300 with 370-ish seats? Even if they did the business section, you'd maybe be down to 320, but can you actually fill 320 seats every day? So you don't just jump to the biggest airplane right off the bat, right? You have to work it up and build the route a little bit. So there are some issues for Asia. Beijing is not the farthest. It is farther than Tokyo, so ANA doesn't have a problem. But it's not as far as the Shanghai service we had. It's not as far as Taipei and Seoul and those cities. So the 787 becomes not as attractive going to Asia. Once you get about past Beijing, it becomes a challenge. And you'll see some of that later as we look at some other cities. So here's all the airlines that we had respond to us and the couple that didn't. So Air Canada didn't respond. California Pacific only flies to Carlsbad. They don't need to respond. It's a short enough flight.
Didn't they just cease operations last week?
They temporarily halted operations.
Yeah.
So Frontier, it didn't answer, but there's enough other companies that fly the 319, 320 to those cities that we can assure ourselves that we're comfortable. Lufthansa has left, but it wasn't an issue. Again, it had 4 engines. It could lose one and still be at 75% power. So you're more worried about the twin engine airplanes that lose one and you're at 50% power. And then UPS didn't respond, but normally the cargo airplanes cube out before they wait out. So it's probably not an issue. We did get FedEx to respond, and you'll see that in a little bit. So here's the down and dirty. ANA, no passenger penalties in 1, 4, 7, or 10. Scenario 9, they don't like. Hainan, scenario 4 has obstacles, significant payload and passenger hits because they currently use the West Corridor, the lower spot. British Airways, 4 and 7, no impact. 9, 10 have impacts. Alaska, American, Aeromexico, Delta, Southwest, Volaris, no penalties as long as when we're in South Flow, it's less than 92 degrees. South Flow normally happens during a storm frontal passage. That normally doesn't happen at 92 degrees. Weird things do happen, but normally those two things don't line up on the same day. United, oddly enough, the 737-900ER performs less well than the 737-800. So the 900 would have trouble getting to Newark. The 800 didn't have any problems for scenario 4 that were of any impact to them. Hawaiian switched out from the 767 to the A321neo, which is a brand new plane from Airbus. And Honolulu, Maui, and Kona have no passenger penalties, some cargo penalties. Lahui would probably have some passenger penalties, but I don't think it's anything significant. Currently, Hawaiian only flies to Honolulu and Maui, so those are the 2 places they go. FedEx, cargo penalties in most scenarios. However, again, the difference between cubing out and waiting out is different. I mean, a lot of times you remember, you get these Amazon boxes on your front porch. They're about 3 cubic feet, and they have one small little bolt in it, right? So it's cubed out long before it waits out, and that's what they're shipping. So a lot of times the cargo planes don't actually have a weight issue as much as they have a it's all full issue. So we looked at some other domestic markets. I just want to get my presentation somewhat caught up. I'm going this off memory for this. Anchorage, Boston, Miami. I tried to grab the 3 points in the U.S. that are furthest from us, kind of the 3 corners other than San Diego. No issue to Anchorage. Boston, the 737-800 performs well, just 1 passenger, but all the cargo is gone. The A320 has some issues in Boston. With scenario 4, they lose 23 people. Miami, the A320 has some issues, but the 737-800 doesn't. So, and those configurations, the 175 for the 737-800 is kind of a Southwest configuration. 1 class piled in there, fairly dense. You start breaking it into a 2 class, you're going to lose those 2 or 3 seats right away just by, spreading out for first class. You're going to lose that many easy. So, so then I started looking at, I don't want to be just today's airport. I want to be what our business community needs tomorrow. So I started picking cities, not necessarily because I want to fly there, but because it gives me a distance ring around the airport with winds aloft in different directions. So I went south, I went west, I went east. So we picked up Frankfurt, Beijing, Taipei, Rio, Hong Kong, Delhi, and Dubai. And you can see the distance miles for each of those flights. So as you see when we get to the next page, your break is somewhere around 6,000 miles is where you start getting penalties, depending on the winds. Beijing's getting it at 5,900. But some of the other cities aren't having such a bad time because the winds aren't quite as much of a factor. So if we go, we'll look at those things. Rio de Janeiro is the top one. You may not be able to read this, but you have the handout.
It's in the memo.
Okay, it's in the memo. So Rio is the top one. The 787 doesn't perform well. The Terps only line is scenario 4. If you've noticed, that's kind of the one that always had the least amount of issue. So scenario 4, the 787 loses 60. Currently, in our current configuration, it can get to Rio with no problem. So, but with the the changes to OEI, potentially it would have a problem. Taipei would not make it with a 787. You would not make Hong Kong or any of the others, Delhi or Dubai, with a 787. The 777-300ER could make it Hong Kong, Taipei, and Rio. The A350, which is the 787 equivalent from Airbus, the new carbon fiber super high-tech plane, can make it to Rio and Taipei, but probably not Hong Kong. You'd lose about 23 people. That might be affordable, especially if you do a configuration, because again, that 325 seats on the A350 is a full one-class configuration, so you may be able to make that one. And then you've got the A330-200 in that very left column that can make the top three. You start losing 55, 65. Those are fairly big numbers. In 787, you're up almost 200 people you'd be losing. So, so what this tells me is if we make this change to OEI, it's not that these city pairs are out of our reach. They're out of our reach for the 787. And I think, you know, when we were talking to Korean years ago about Seoul service, and we were going back and forth with them, they weren't forecasting the 787. They were planning on a 777 because they knew the distance. Whether we have OEI or not, it's a long ways to fly. You need a lot of fuel, and so that was their assumption when we were talking to them. So it's not always an OEI issue. Sometimes the equipment's just not right no matter what we do here. You have to bring in a bigger plane because of that challenge to get that distance. So let's go on to the next. The economic impact part kind of talks through to the downtown core. Again, you're adding 5 to 35 feet if you got rid of OEI and went up to turf. So it's not a significant amount of square feet. You know, if you get 35 feet on a building, you're talking maybe 2 floors. It might only be over part because it's a slope, right? It might only be the back half of the building that can get 2 floors. So there's not a tremendous amount of growth potential. And when there's a scatter map that we have, that there's only a couple buildings that have the 35 feet. Most of them are 0 to 5 foot benefit. So Diridon Station, though, is a much different situation. So if we go with scenario 4, they pick up 8.6 million square feet in Diridon Station area. If all of those potential building sites went up to whatever is the TERPS area, we did not protect for OEI. That's a lot of square footage. That's a significant thing. Go ahead. Yeah. So we looked at our financial impacts on the aviation side. You have airline revenue loss because I sold you a ticket. Now you're not flying. I need to give you that money back. And potentially I have to give you a voucher too, right? If you are going to fly, I have to give you a voucher. You stay an extra night. I have to get you a hotel room, or I have to bus you up to San Francisco. So there's a cost involved in not flying you like you asked me to. PFC revenue to the airport, because if you go out of San Francisco, I lose the PFC, or if you just don't go at all, I lose the PFC. You don't spend any money in the concession. You don't spend any money. The concession doesn't make any money. This is my share. This is their share. And then other airline impacts to them. I don't know what we threw in there, but there are other things. Do you remember what we threw in there?
Yeah, it's, for example, if they decided to make a company-wide decision to always consider OEI impacts across the board for all their flights, those impacts are in there. Again, and John indicated they could choose to rebook that passenger to another day or another flight and then cover the hotel. These are all the indirect that are really a little bit hard to quantify, and so they were thrown. And so the direct ones are really easy to quantify. Those are a little bit.
So Air China, who used to serve Shanghai from here, had an OEI issue with their airplane, and so every day, because they only flew 3 days a week, it's hard to rebook you. Could you just stay in San Jose for a couple more days till I fly on Saturday, and then you can jump on my plane because we'll have better weather by Saturday? So they just always booked the plane as if they were going to take off to the south, even though it only happened 13% of the time. And how much percentage of that 13% actually occurred when they were departing? They just decided to never fill the plane past that point. So they booked out, was it 47 seats, Mark?
It was 45. something
45,
like that.
okay. So north of 40 seats were just permanently X'd off on the reservation system. So they would never sell them. So that's a financial hit, even when we have takeoffs to the north. But that was their philosophy is, I can't protect you out of San Francisco. I'm only flying 3 days a week out of San Jose to Shanghai. So I'm just never going to be in that embarrassing position of saying, Dan, would you mind waiting 2 days and flying out on Saturday? Just never going to go there. I'll just never sell the plane out all the way. That was a tremendous cost to them, and not necessarily all why they pulled out, but it was obviously a financial component in that larger decision when we talked with Air China. So those are the kind of things that Judy's talking about in that other impact. So let's go to the next one. So as a flight matures, you hope the load factor goes up, right? You know, you start with a brand new flight, it's probably at 60, 65% load factor. It gets up to 70. The second year, it's breaking 70. Third year, you hope you're up close to 80. On an international flight, you're probably good to just settle at about 85. I think the airline predicts more, but I think realistically, between summer and winter and seasonal issues, 85% might be a pretty strong plane for you. So as we go out into the future, the losses increase because that load factor increases, right? If I'm at 75% load factor, I could probably absorb those 45 seats that got blocked out on the Air China flight because those people didn't buy a ticket. I'm at 75% load factor, so the cost would be very little. As the flight matures, I'm going to be up at 85%, maybe 90% load factor. Those are real bodies now that have to come off. So that's why the impact keeps growing as the years go by. So we tried to look at it. No building's going to be built for 5 years. If we make this decision tomorrow, Google's not building buildings for 5 years. So by the time the buildings come, those planes are going to be more mature, more full. You're going to be at the point where you're really affecting people, not just empty seats that didn't get sold. So that's why the scales go up on those. The other thing to think about is, and this is the positive side of that, as that flight matures and we get to 85% full, maybe 90% full, what happens then is they say, where is that point where I can just jump to the 777-300ER, right, and have a load factor of 75% on that plane and work my way back up again, continuing to build the demand on the larger airplane. So there is a point where they make that decision and say, maybe it's not all year, maybe it's just the summer months. I'm going to go to the bigger plane on the summer months because there's more travel and I'm up at that 95% load factor, so I'm just going to go for the bigger plane. So there are decision points like that, and this maturity part is where I'm hoping that some of those flights, like the Hainan flight 5 years from now, will be more mature, and we'll be having the conversation with Hainan about, hey, is it the right time to choose that 777-300ER? I've noticed the load factors are, fairly high on this every single day, and maybe it's the right time to talk about this expansion. So those things will come over the next 3, 4, 5 years, I think. Go ahead. And then this is kind of the economic impact to the developers. So what is 8.6 million square feet worth? It's worth some taxes to the city. It's worth jobs. It's worth all sorts of other pieces. And it kind of takes out the sales tax for the city of San Jose, trying to say that this city has a vested interest in building Dearborn higher. They get a lot of taxes out of that. And then you have the aviation impact and the real estate impact. If you don't build the 8.6 million square feet, you're out $747 million of investment in the city. And then the taxes that go along with it. So our aviation number seems very small compared to that. So, the impact to the airlines is $2 million. The impact to development downtown is many, many, many millions of dollars. So that's kind of what we had to look at. And I didn't want this to be strictly a math problem. I wanted it to be, can we get to the middle and work it both ways? Can we both win out of this? That's my last slide, right, Matt?
Yes,
okay.
that it is.
So what we're trying to get to at this point is, can we realistically build to the terps without destroying our existing service at the airport and without tying our hands too tight for future service. There are some cities in this world that we will never fly to, period. No, we're not even going to ask. They're just not markets for our tech valley to go to certain places. But there are some serious ones that I put up there on, Taipei, Seoul, Hong Kong, Shanghai again. Those are all very viable city pairs. Frankfurt's viable. The Middle East, maybe for India through traffic at best, but that's not always a moneymaker when you're carrying through traffic. So, do those really float to the top as things we're going to chase religiously? So we have to make that call. So we're going forward with a recommendation to do scenario 4, which does impact us a little bit, not on our current process. It only impacts Hainan. Again, 13% of the time on the days that 13% happens when they depart. But there is an impact to scenario 4. What we've asked is that the council look at the opportunity for a community-funded airline assistance program. They often do this in other cities to get new service. The community gets together, puts a pot of money and says, hey, British Airways, if you fly from the middle of the country at some city that doesn't have service to London, and you fly to London, we'll use this pot of money to make sure there's always this many sold seats on your, if you don't sell that many, we'll buy them with this pot of money to make sure you're profitable. And so the community gets behind that thinking, we'll give it a little bit of seed money, it'll naturally grow, and then it'll be healthy, and we won't have to use our money anymore. So what I'm saying is, could we take that same scenario, get a fund that's maybe funded by the developers that are gaining 8.6 million square feet from what they are today, and say, let's put together a fund so that when Hainan has to take off 23 people, or 51 people, because it happened on the wrong day that they were totally full, and it was the 13%, and they were departing, then we say, okay, so we'll buy those, we'll help you compensate those passengers that got bumped. We'll get them the vouchers, we'll pay for the vouchers, we'll pay to get them bused to San Francisco, whatever it takes, out of this fund. Not that Hainan makes money, but that Hainan doesn't lose money, right? That they're not taking a loss because of OEI. And so we're asking to kind of tie these two things together as we go forward in this proposal. The other thing that I wanted to touch on that I touched on with Dan when we talked a couple weeks ago, I explained to him the fact that when the FAA makes an airspace situation and says you can't build above terps, the federal government is exempt from a takings clause. And so the landowner doesn't get anything for the federal government saying you can't build above this certain height. The FAA stopped at terps. So OEI is our problem with the airlines as a partner. And so if we were to artificially restrict this to something below that, currently the Dirdon Station plan is restricting construction over the West Corridor, not me. It's the Dirdon Station plan that said the tallest thing is going to be the baseball stadium. If I come in and say now it's going to be OEI, then I need to potentially, if I get sued, reimburse property owners for that differential, that 150 vertical feet that they lost over their parcel. As an example, Las Vegas had to take a bond out for $350 million to buy aviation rights outside their airport. Now, Rosemary is making payments every month on that bond and doesn't have a building to show for it. So she's making payments on a $350 million bond and doesn't have anything except airspace that all she could do is fly through it occasionally. So there's a real issue there. And so in my conversation with Dan, it's balancing several different things. A potential lawsuit for the airport, for the city, the need to grow downtown, because remember, that 8.6 million square feet is going to house 20,000 employees. Where do you think they're going to fly when those Google employees fly? They're going to fly out of the airport that's 3 miles away. They're not going to drive to San Francisco. So it's good for us too to have that development. So we kind of have to work together to find that solution that brings us the right mix of stuff. Am I on the short end of the stick? I don't think so. I think we have a strategy. I mean, I point to Mark. He's our air service guy, as you know. He presents to you all the time. But Mark and I have talked. We have a strategy about what cities are important, what cities are next on our list. And obviously, we need to now know that when we go talk to somebody about City X, what airplane is the airplane we're going to have to talk about filling and working through the scenario with them. And so, it's just another thing we have to do as we continue to grow. I don't think it's insurmountable. I think Korean was ready to launch with a 777. There was other reasons why that didn't occur, but I think they were ready to go with a 777, and they felt we had the market for it, and we'll see. I mean, that was a long time ago. It's a different world. It's a different airport. It's a different aviation community, but there was a carrier that was ready to go with a 777. So I don't think it's out of reach for us. I think it just means that Mark and I have to work it differently as we go forward, saying, now we have to guarantee that you'll have 200 people a day instead of 150 people a day ready to fly to City X, because you're going to need to use the larger airplane to do it. So again, I'm happy to answer questions. I think that's everything I wanted to cover. The questions probably will bring out the rest of the dirty details. So we'll go from there, Dan.
Thank you, Director. All right, I want to open it up to the floor of commissioners that may have questions over the presentation that you just saw. Commissioner Head.
Does scenario 4 allow the Diridon station area to basically build buildings as tall as Adobe?
Basically, yeah.
I mean, in a
if you're looking at it in a general stance of, if this piece of land is as far away from us as Adobe is,
Yeah.
yes, it would be about that same height.
so that the long-range planning picture is that Adobe within the downtown area is as high as it gets and if we went with scenario 4, Diridon would have the same ability to have the same height. The same height would be uniform, plus or
Relatively,
minus
yes.
over everything.
Right.
Okay.
I got a
Commissioner
whole
Green.
bunch of questions, but I'll start. So if we're going to build Diridon up, right now the ILS 30 left decision height's 257 feet, and the RNAV GPS to 30 right is 255 feet, roughly 200 feet above. What will that scenario 4 do to change those?
Absolutely nothing.
Absolutely nothing.
Because
Okay.
TERPS protects those.
Right, and so you're
And
gonna
so,
stay,
and we will
you're
stay
gonna
below TERPS. So anything is your normal stuff. You're both engines operating, you're
Right,
coming in on the
yeah.
approach, or you're doing your departure, you're doing your SID out of here with both engines spinning,
Right.
nothing changes.
Okay. And then doing a little research this weekend, this more for my fellow commissioners. China will have the highest passenger traffic in the world by 2040. They will carry 19% of the world's air travelers somewhere in or out of China. Option 4, speaking from a 30-year airline career, I seriously doubt we're going to get a lot of consideration for taking 56 people off to Beijing, probably a similar number to Shanghai, Guangzhou. The big industrial centers of China are going to be off the table. I thought our job as commissioners was to do what's in the best interest of the airport. The San Jose developers are going to make money on Google property. What we're talking about now is how much more money they're going to make. Google doesn't care if their passengers, that they have to send engineers to China, drive to San Francisco. Google doesn't care. But that's passengers that we're not going to have out of San Jose. I think looking at where aviation will be 20 years from now, we will be incredibly short-sighted to change our existing flight profiles.
So
Professional, personal opinion.
I think that some of the points you made are very accurate if you're anticipating continuing to utilize the 787 for some of those flights. And so I think when you look at those cities in China, 777-300ER doesn't have problems getting to them. When we talk about Google moving 20,000 employees in here, and even the ones from their other campuses, if we have these services, there shouldn't be a problem for us jumping from a 787 to a 777 when you have that many more employees here traveling.
Well, again, with all due respect, the trend in the aviation industry right now is not bigger airplanes. It's 787s and A350s, smaller capacity on long, thin routes. The 4-engine airplanes that we talk about with Lufthansa, they've gone away because they're not efficient. 777-300ER carries a lot of people a long way, but it is nowhere near as efficient as an A350 or the 787. And Boeing and Airbus both are selling way more 787s and A350s than they are 777-300ERs or the A380. The A380, the largest passenger jet in the world, is probably going to close down because that's not the most efficient way to get from city to city unless you have an incredible demand. On a separate note, which I thought was really interesting, Apple is buying 50 business class seats a day between San Francisco and Beijing for their employees. Google's just going to send people up to fly on United to Beijing, and we're going to lose those passengers. Again, we are not going to grow internationally if we put these kind of draconian restrictions on our flights to Asia. And Asia is where the growth is. China, India, Indonesia, Hong Kong, Delhi. We're just going to knock ourselves out of the race to be an international airport. Now, if we decide we want to be a nice little regional airport that, has a flight to London or maybe one to Frankfurt, I guess that's the decision to be made. But if we're going to be an international airport, if we're going to compete with San Francisco, and I mean compete, we cannot restrict our ability to fly to Asia.
I wanted to tack on just a little bit to only because we were talking about aircraft. I ran some calculations, and I'm not going to say that they're totally accurate, but cost of the 777 is around $320 million. Cost of 787-900 is around $289 million. So you've got at least $31 million more for the airplane. The fuel that it guzzles, though, is tremendous. 735 additional gallons per hour of flight. So for a 10-hour flight, you're tacking on the cost of the airline of almost $40,000 for that one 10-hour flight in fuel. I think airlines are going to be looking at the cost of their equipment and the cost of fuel, because it's not just $31 million for the cost of an airplane is one thing. But if on every one of my 10-hour flights going over there, I'm shelling out an extra $40,000 over the 787, I'm not sure that as a business owner I'd be looking to do that.
Well, the other thing you got to keep in consideration on these long Pacific flights, you can't fly the route with one airplane. If you go from New York to London, one airplane goes over, they turn it around an hour and a half later, and it goes back. On these flights to Asia, it requires 2 airplanes on the route because they're passing each other going each way because it takes so long. So multiplied by 2 the difference in buying 777-300ERs versus A350s or 787s. Again, airlines want predictability, which is why our first briefing tonight, airlines like the idea of knowing exactly what I'm going to pay for 10 years down the road. That's perfect. When I start a route, yes, I'm only guessing I'm going to have 60% load factor the first year, 75. Delta Airlines 2018 load factor is going to come in right around 87, 88%, I believe, and that's money making. If I'm at 75%, I'm not making money. And if I know I'm gonna have to take 56 passengers off and 9,500 pounds of cargo in order to go to Beijing, I am not gonna commit $250 to $300 million airplanes to that kind of uncertainty, even though it's only 13% of the year. Because again, the 13% of the time that it happens to me, I've got an asset sitting here that either can't take off, or I'm unloading people with all the associated costs. And if I have a good load factor, I can't put those people on tomorrow's flight because tomorrow's flight's already full. And we saw time and time again this last summer where smaller airlines like Frontier, they cancel a flight somewhere and their people are stranded for a week because there's no ability to get them on a completely full flight. So again, I understand the rock and a hard place that the director's under from the city council and the building developers, but I, as a commissioner, cannot in any way good faith approve this plan. Not even debatable.
Just 1 second, Joe. Are there any scenarios that you saw that were presented that had, favorable outcomes in your mind as a pilot and as a commissioner?
No.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Head.
Follow up on that, and the reason that the problem is that the 787s bound to Asia need the Diridon Station low building profile in order to safely exit the airport during
On
southbound.
an engine out. That's the whole thing. But again, as airline pilots, every time an airline pilot takes off, he's thinking, I'm having an engine failure today.
Yeah.
Every single time. And we shouldn't say we. Airline pilots brief the specific engine out profiles for each airport they operate at. The operating procedure manuals for each airline has the specific engine out procedures at airports where that exists. And what we're basically telling people is that we're not going to let you have an engine out over Diridon Station.
Okay. Do the airlines that fly to Asia all have an OEI exit over Diridon? Is that what they've chosen to do? Since they choose to do that rather than the FAA?
Well, Hainan does a straight out for 1-2 left when they're using that one, and they do the Diridon course correction for 1-2 right. Let's see, where's ANA? ANA does the straight out because that's the ICAO model, and so they do the straight out and go over the top, so they don't even use the west corridor going to Tokyo. And there's a difference. The FAA and ICAO, the international organization, agree on a lot of things, but they don't agree on emergency procedures all the time. And the FAA allows for course corrections and some other things. ICAO frowns on it quite a bit. So a lot of our international carriers, and even some of our domestics that just have union agreements that don't allow them to make course corrections during an emergency, do the straight out. So regardless, there'll be some that just won't do it because it's the last thing you want to have to think about as you're concentrating in the cockpit trying to keep the plane flying is and by the way, let's turn right now. Because that's just one other thing you have to put in your mind as you're trying to secure that engine and do all the other things that you need to do on that emergency checklist. So it's probably, I don't know who would fly what, and if we were sitting here trying to presuppose what airline would go to Asia, whether they do a straight out or the right course correction, it's not known until they get here. I think though, it is trying to go back to some of Commissioner Greenlee's comments. The A350 was in that assessment, and it made it to Taipei, which is a southern Asia city, without any penalty hits. So it's not all about going from a 787 to the 777. The 777 just had more opportunities and more destinations. The other thing we need to realize is I don't actually think of us as competing with San Francisco on it. We're never going to be the big guy on the block. We don't have the recognition around the world to be the San Francisco of the Bay Area. So I think we need to manage our expectations about, am I going to get a flight to Guangzhou? Yes, it is a tech center, I guess. Mark talks to me about it every once in a while, but do we have the power to pull that flight in on the reverse side? We all know where it is. I actually don't, but I mean, the tech people that want to know where it is and know they want to go there. But on that side of the flight, do they know where San Jose is and where they want to go, or do they think, no, San Francisco, that's Silicon Valley? I mean, we do still have a reputation issue here, and so I think managing our expectation internationally is important. We are never going to be San Francisco. I will never chase to be a San Francisco, and understand that our international traffic here is probably 3%, maybe 4% of our entire traffic. So the ability for us to build a tremendous North American presence, not just domestic, but all of North America presence, and solve that equation with 20,000 more people riding on those airplanes is also very important to our bottom line. The international flights are romance. They're frosting on the cake. We would never make it with our 8 international departures. I'd have to fold up, shut the doors, and go home. The domestic market is what builds this airport, what grows this airport, what pays for the bills. Believe me, the international carriers don't even pay their way because of how the FIS costs and a bunch of other things. This is not the meeting for this, but the domestic market is what really enables us. And the frosting on the cake is fun, and Mark and I enjoy talking about this, and we enjoy having the success of another European flight or another Asian flight. But it's not where our growth is. If you look at the last 20 cities we added, I think there was 4 international cities. They were all in Mexico, which could have been reached by anything. So you get those big international romance things once in a while, and I think we still have a shot at Taipei, and I think we still have a shot at Shanghai again. And I think, based on our conversations about Seoul, I think we have a shot at that with the right airplane. And it was always in the mind of being the right airplane when we did it. And Frankfurt, I think, is a great connection for us. Anywhere on the continent is a doable connection for us. To get to Dubai or even to India, I don't know that we could fill that plane. And filling airplanes with Indian through traffic, is not a moneymaker. That market just is anti-fair. It's the cheap end of that ticket. And so, Lufthansa said that to us. We'll fill it with the India traffic when we have to, but we prefer different traffic because the ticket yield is different and it's more profitable. And so it's a balancing act of what really we think is our future and what we'd like our dream future to be. And I think we need to stay realistic. Again, I'm going to present to the council the bad side too. I'm going to tell them, look, you're not going to Dubai. You're not going to Delhi with this plan. You're going to only be able to get to Southern Asia with a certain number of airplanes. You decide. You are the people that set policy. I just implement your policy, right? And so I'm going to advise them honestly. You will not get these flights.
Well,
if that's where you want to go.
Google's going to build in Diridon Station whether we let them go 150 feet higher or not. Google's going to put 20,000 employees there whether we let them go higher or not. That 8.6 million, I'm guessing that's all of it, not just the extra
No, that's the
80
extra.
feet. That's the extra 80 feet. So how many...
Well, 70 to 150.
Okay, so how many tens of millions of extra square feet are we going to get regardless? So the question is, how much money are we going to let the developers make versus how are we going to hamstring the airport? That's really what it comes down to.
What about in scenario number
We are starting
4?
to miss the environmental review. So just
Yeah.
food for thought.
In scenario number 4, we've got an issue with Boston, we've got an issue
No.
with Miami.
Only on an A320. The 737 will make them both. So again, and I don't think there's, there is a cost differential between a 777 and a 787, and you both pointed it out, I know, with rounded numbers. But the differential between an A320 and a 737-800 is negligible. And so, and with most of our fleet being on the 737 side of the fence, it's not that hard to decide. I mean, even Alaska, after buying Virgin, had pulled their Airbus fleet off of our New York flights and put that, they're taking their Airbus fleet and they're moving it north and south along the coast because it's a great haul for that kind of a flight. And they put their 737-800s going to Newark and JFK. Not because the other one didn't do well, but they like the product they have on their 800s and they've just reassigned their Airbus fleet a different direction. So it's not that extreme to think of if we were going to do Boston, which we already do Boston on an A320 with JetBlue, and they've done it for eons, and JetBlue responded that there wasn't any problem with 4 in their mind because they probably don't have a full configuration. They have an Economy Plus or something that gives you like 4 more. I keep looking at Mark because I want him to nod at me that I'm not lying. They have like an Economy Plus
Yes.
that has like 4 more inches of space or something like that. So they pulled out a few rows of seats, right? If you do 5 rows with 4 more inches, that means the whole row's gone now. And so they pulled out 6 seats. Well, if you only lost 4 with OEI, well then that A320 does just fine to Boston. So again, we went with the max configuration, right? The max density on the seats, and then there's different issues. And I understand. I understand your part. We are hemming ourselves in on certain routes. And the question is, are those real opportunities for us? We have trouble telling people in Shanghai and Frankfurt at the time, and the people that were connecting through Frankfurt, where the heck San Jose was in the world. I mean, it's a real story. I mean, I'm not
Yeah,
making
but that's
it up.
kind of a
So-
different discussion on our marketing, and I mean, we've had these discussions in the past about how do we get the world to know that this is the capital of Silicon Valley, not San Francisco. But again, we're certainly not going to tell anybody in China or India where San Jose is because we're not going to be able to fly there.
Well, I don't think China is true, but I'll agree with you on India, but I'll reserve judgment on China. So.
I want to go to
Because we already
Commissioner
applied.
Hendricks.
Not at 56 people.
So, first of all, thank you for both presentations. And I'm not a pilot, so I don't have the technical expertise of Commissioner Greenlee, but I'm looking more from a common sense policy perspective. Once we rein ourselves in and restrict our ability to go to China, and I believe that China is our next market, India is our next market, 40 years, everyone's going to know where San Jose is. I do believe that. I think things are going to change beyond my lifetime. So I think we have to think about that, is where we're going to be 30 or 40 years from now. So when I reviewed all this papers and all the materials that they sent, yes, some of it's over my head, but some of it's not. And I would want to know just a couple of questions. I have 5. So I don't know if now's the opportunity to ask these questions, or should we convene another meeting? Because I don't want to take an opportunity from my fellow commissioners to see the other meeting. My questions are probably pretty quick.
You can, I mean,
Can I
fire
ask
away.
them?
Commissioners are welcome to leave anytime they want. I mean, as long as we keep a quorum. I mean, if
Okay.
somebody wanted to get up and do the environmental because they're comfortable with what
Okay.
they just discussed,
Okay,
you guys are welcome. I mean, I
Yeah.
don't need to step on Dan, but I mean, they can leave at any time they want. I mean, that's-
Absolutely.
okay.
So,
All right, so my first question, we have an airport layout plan, correct? Okay. And was this study that you did, was it taken to the Santa Clara County Land Use Commission? And why not?
because right now it's not a land use issue.
This is not a land use issue. When we build up,
When they propose the taller building and they have a use, then that is a land use that would then go to the land use commission.
Okay.
All we're doing is setting building and code enforcement policy as to how high someone could build if they wanted to put a use on their land. But until you define the use of, I want to take my 1 acre parcel downtown and make a 300-foot apartment building, or is it a 300-foot office building, then it becomes a land use that may have to be reviewed. But again, if it's under TERPs, the ALUC will put maybe a little guidance on it that it may affect one engine in operative procedures, but they're not going to be able to say it's against any rule, because TERPs is the rule, not OEI.
Okay.
And I mean, you can defer to Ron, but I'm pretty close on that you're not going to go beyond terps.
No, the AOUC has not adopted the TERPs. We're still using the Part 77 services.
Okay, well, that's even
More restrictive.
That's more
Yeah.
restrictive, right?
But
it's-
Part 77 and TERPs are together in there. When I say TERPs, that's all of those blended together. They're sometimes TERPs is higher, sometimes Part 77 is higher, depending on where you are in the world. So both of those are what I'm talking about when I say TERPs.
Okay. Then what about the Caltrans Division of Aeronautics? Is that state body involved at all in these discussions?
No, you don't have to be.
They don't have to be.
No.
Do they have the ability to govern what we're talking about here in any way, shape, or form?
I think my recollection is they have chosen not to engage because the FAA has. So the FAA has rules set, and then OEI, again, is not a safety issue, it is an economic issue, and so they're allowing local jurisdictions to develop solutions for OEI appropriate for that community.
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking that we're sort of catering to a business community and folding for money, for corporate interests, and
Well-
not for our airport. So as a commissioner, with the best interest of this airport in my mind, I would caution the city of San Jose, the city council, from adopting what you're proposing here, because I believe you're going to tie this airport's hands behind its back and we will never be able to grow.
So where do you think I should get the money to buy the 150 vertical feet above every parcel? The $350 million.
I guess do a bond like Las Vegas. I don't
Then
know.
I can't build another building,
Yeah.
and I cannot grow the
Yeah, but
airport
that-
because I won't.
Okay, and then
have
the
enough
other,
money.
just the other question I had when I was looking through all these materials, I'm assuming that the airport has FAA grants.
Yeah.
Yes. And there's certain assurances that the airport or the sponsor needs to guarantee the FAA, one of those being protecting the airspace.
To the Terps and Part 77 level, which we are.
So we're compliant with our grants
Yep.
when we implement scenario
Because
4.
the FAA doesn't even enforce OEI. They push that onto the airlines to make sure they comply. So we cover everything that we're supposed to
Okay.
with the FAA with Terps and Part 77.
Okay. All right, well,
But
thank
very
you.
good questions, and you must have done a lot of research because you hit a number of good areas. So.
And then the only other common concern I have is the poor person that gets kicked off the plane.
Mhm.
Are we not thinking about that person, that little person? And I think that's awful, what we would consider giving somebody a voucher and a ticket and a meal and a hotel and thinking that's okay. When I missed my dad's funeral or whatever reason I was going to these places. So I think we need to look out for the little person who's trying to use our service.
And
Those are my
I had
comments.
actually written down as you were making your presentation that I didn't see any consideration to our consumers that
None.
utilize the airport. And if we want people to utilize the airport, the last thing I think we want them to be saying is, you know what, I was going to Beijing or I was going to Shanghai and I got bumped, I missed my meetings, I missed my family wedding. I'm not flying out of San Jose anymore. I'm going to go out of Oakland or San Francisco. But I do think we have an obligation to the community at large to have some considerations there for that. The other thing that I would ask is, can we get a city legal opinion on your need to buy this airspace above the Deardan station area? I mean, right now they're restricted to a certain height level, correct? So,
There's no there. If the Deardan Station plan stays as it is, then I don't have to buy it.
then you don't have to buy it. So, but you're saying even if the city raises it a little bit, you're going to have to buy the level above that?
No, if the city chooses to keep the Deardan area plan as it is or amend it to something that is slightly higher, it still will. I mean, it's fine because they didn't do it for OEI. But understand, if they raise it up, it's still going to affect OEI. It's still going to drop people off.
So I would think if the city wants to take that on, then they're the ones that ought to be paying it, not us as the airport.
Makes perfect sense, but that's not how it works.
I understand that, but I'd still like to get a city legal opinion on behalf of this commission on that issue.
It's not a problem because many airports have been sued over this and lost, so getting an opinion's not hard.
Commissioner Hendricks.
Just one more thing. Will the commission receive a copy of the downtown airspace and development capacity study that was performed by your consultants?
It's pretty much the PowerPoint. I
Yeah.
guess we can put it in fancy binder.
Isn't there a binder with a little, one of these?
We've had a series of working documents, which have been PowerPoints at the end of the study when we know what the direction is, and given the direction by the city council, there will be report out.
So you don't have a deliverable by the consultant yet?
Not until the end.
Yeah.
Not until the end of your,
And that'll be
Whatever.
too late. I mean, that's after the council has decided which way to
I
go.
won't speak before we're right.
all right.
Commissioner Head?
So let me make a kind of different approach to this. And it's from a marketing business approach. And it's from an approach that there is no distinction, period, between the airport and the city. The city runs the airport. It's a city venture. All the capital and complications of running this are basically affect positively or negatively citizens in San Jose. I appreciate the citizens of Sunnyvale and Mountain View who have experienced a differentiation in their sound issues, but far more citizens in San Jose have been, are now, and will be affected by whatever sound operations come out of this airport. So if we have a certain amount of geography, we have a certain amount of economic activity we want to conduct as a city, we have a series of completely renowned international businesses looking to locate in geography that can threaten some of our air service. I think it's a perfectly natural discussion to say, in order to have the economic activity that the buildings will provide, and they're only just the location for the Googles and that energy, we may lose the ability to do some flying. I'm not saying it has to be that way, but that's a legitimate discussion. And if we have to become an airport that mostly flies domestically, because that's the type of airplanes that can operate now, and we attract Google and Apple expands here, and XYZ they don't even know about is here, and you know, if you look at what we did 25 years ago when we did the whole downtown, the Sharks came, that limited the airport. I think that's a legitimate discussion. Finding a balance there, I don't think is unreasonable, even if we can't fly to every city in Asia directly. And I'm not sure the technology won't change that we will be able to. So I think it's complicated, and I'm kind of leaning toward the macroeconomic look that if we can actually do all that building and put bodies in it that represent the companies that purported to represent it, I think that's a good. I frankly worry more about the planning, delivering the buildings and the actually happening than I do about the airport. And that may be because that's a business I'm familiar with, not the flying business. But that somebody doesn't put one 25-story building up for whatever crazy reason they want to do it, and all the rest of the buildings stay 10 or 15 stories, which would not super negatively affect us. Don't know how to solve that issue, but I worry that one more than I worry the flight issues.
Joe, do you think that Google won't come if we don't approve them building a 70-foot higher building?
No, I think they will come, but will they concentrate their energies here and make us the number one will most things happen here in San Jose? And I think if we're a city of restriction, they won't.
They would have to build a much flatter
Yeah.
campus, which is not what they envisioned for us.
Commissioner Schmidt?
Oh, Pyle, if that's
Oh,
okay.
Pyle.
I don't want to speak on his behalf. One thing I'm curious from just a land use and planning standpoint, it looks like they really just looked at the two scenarios of, well, really one scenario of just building up higher, but what about building maybe more efficiently, things like, building over streets, using public spaces that aren't necessarily used well, parking minimums, right? We spend a lot of money on parking lots that are just housing cars and not housing people and commercial buildings, and so you might be able to get the same kind of density increase just by utilizing the spaces better. And I wonder why the city, again, in the macro level, why didn't they look at that as another scenario?
Google's campus from the sketches that I've seen is looking at opportunities to convert roadways down there to paseo walkways and to integrate buildings above roads and to make it feel like your complex where you live and where you work are integrated into it, not just you go in the front door and you go up 25 stories to a giant
Right.
building. They're looking at unusual things, but they want a couple iconic buildings that set heights, and then luckily ours is a slope, right? Coming from the airport, it goes up as it gets further away, and so they want a couple really tall buildings. They want some medium-sized buildings. They want some shorter-sized buildings, and then in between, they're going to do really creative, fun stuff that brings you in connection with your surroundings and stuff. And it's really neat, but they need some in order to make it interesting on the plane, right, on the flatter surface. You need some density to contain the people, so that when you don't have a tall building, you can do something unusual and exciting and a blending of the Los Gatos Creek into your rooftop patio kind of. They're doing weird stuff. I mean, it's really cool, but they need some iconic things to store the people in, right? So that when you do a short area, you can make it very interactive and creative.
But how much percentage of that area that we're looking at is Google versus other developers? I mean, and will those other
80-20.
developers really? Is that much?
In the end, it'll be in that neighborhood, I would imagine. And I'm not an OED person, so I'm guessing totally, but
I have to leave.
are you going to the environmental
Let me
stuff?
just,
Oh, okay.
before we lose all of our commissioners, we can't take action tonight. Does this commission want a formal recommendation to the city council, or do we not want to make any recommendation? If so, we would need to schedule a meeting for next week, either Tuesday or Thursday of next week.
I'll be out of town anyway.
Okay? Can I hear from commissioners on what they'd like to look at here?
I'd like to make a recommendation as a commission. I think that's our job to the
Our
city
job.
council.
Okay? Who is available next week, either on Tuesday or Thursday?
Thursday.
Thursday,
I will make myself available.
Joe.
What's the 17th?
Yes, no, 17th is this week,
That's
right?
That's the
Oh,
24th.
this is next week, sorry.
24th.
24th,
Yeah, I'm good.
Ken,
I think I'm here.
and
I
Allison,
won't
you're-
be, but that's
I can
okay.
do
I don't
either.
need me to. So
I'll be
I'll just
here.
let you know, Judy will be here.
Well, and our apologies that the agenda didn't go out in a
It's our
format
fault.
that allowed us to do this. Why don't we schedule for a 6 o'clock meeting next Thursday? This will be the only item on the agenda. For action, we can have additional discussions. What I'd like to ask of each of you is to take the time. There's a lot of material here. Take the time to go through this. And, so you can be informed. We only got this on Wednesday night or Thursday. There's a lot of stuff to go through here. And let's take into consideration what the director has given us today, and see what kind of a recommendation we can come up with. It may be to support the recommendation of the airport. It may be to look at another scenario. It may be not to support. But we need, I believe Commissioner Greenlee is correct that as an airport commission, this is probably in the 4 years that I've been here, the most important topic of discussion, and I really believe it needs a fair amount of consideration, not something we should rush.
And Judy will be here, and Judy is probably smarter at this than I am. So don't feel that you can't assemble questions again and ask Judy, because she knows this probably. She deals with this airspace more than I do. So don't be afraid that you can't, over this next week, assemble 5-6 questions apiece and fire them away at Judy. I had to take them. She can take them.
I also, before we break, want to just remind you, you each got an envelope that dealt with your parking here at the airport. That's for you to report on your Form 700s, and they're due by April 1st. So, take the opportunity to get your Form 700s file. Any announcements before we adjourn? Anything from anyone on the commission? Commissioner Hendricks.
I'll be calling in from Oregon, Tillamook, like I did last
Just-
time.
Okay.
Forward the information to me and I'll talk to you about that.
Okay,
We'll get-
so that would be on
Yeah,
my,
we can make that happen.
okay.
Okay.
And then for me, as I have, I'm not getting my packets through the mail, so if there's any materials that I can take tonight printed, would be very, very helpful.
Are you going to the next meeting?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
All right, I'd like to thank everyone for attending tonight. I'm sorry we had to rush things a bit. We stand adjourned, and I will see you next Thursday.
Now that it's adjourned, in your old room, the Boeing McDonnell Douglas, they're doing an environmental review for our for some environmental work that we're doing. So if you want to be involved in your Boeing McDonnell Douglas, where you normally meet for the airport.
So then
for the
let's-
airport. I wouldn't invite you to environmental or anything else.
I can hand it to you faster than I can mail it.
Okay.
Mail it, it's gotta go downtown.
Saving money, no worries.
No, I'd
That's actually a very good question, and one that I was actually thinking through this. Part of it is part of it is you're not on the planning portion, I assume, so my assumption is you don't know anything about their plans.
Oh, yeah, and I know nothing about it.
So not knowing. Not gonna be.